brochure, I would have called this class Teaching Dialectic in a Practical Way, rather than, what does it say, Teaching Practical Dialectic. It's more of a class on how to teach your children to use dialectic and to cultivate their dialectical reasoning skills. And I'll say first that I teach dialectic in my rhetoric class, because dialectic and rhetoric, as Richard Weaver says, dialectic in the restored man, he says. In the restored man, dialectic and rhetoric will go hand in hand as the regime of the human faculties intended that they should. What he means by that is a well-rounded person is equipped both to appeal to the head and to the heart. And if you try to use rhetoric alone, you just get a lot of fluff. If you try to use dialectic alone, if you operate as a pure dialectician, then you lapse into a situation where you become kind of a cold, calculating, detached person who is infatuated with the pursuit of abstract notions, but not really inclined to serve one's neighbor or pay attention to the actual people who God's given you to be in relationship. So putting them both together is important, and practically speaking, in my class on rhetoric, which is essentially my core course that I teach 17 and 18-year-old freshmen, it's a public speaking class, but it has a highly classical rhetorical approach, and by that I mean I teach it in a classical liberal arts fashion that's informed by Dorothy L. Sayers' work on the Trivium. So I focus on practice and cultivating eloquence and wisdom rather than learning a lot and mastering a lot of readings on rhetorical theory. There's 2,500 years of rhetorical theory, for goodness sake. It takes, when I teach it, in the upper division rhetorical theory classes, I have Greco-Roman to medieval, and then Renaissance to contemporary rhetorical theory in another class. So, you know, to try to give 17 and 18-year-old kids, and honestly, I think this class should be taught more to 14. 15-year-old. It's more assumed, that's more in keeping with the medieval curriculum. Because they're ready for it at that age. So take heart if you're teaching junior high and high school kids. They definitely benefit from this and learn it. Anyway, it works really well to teach them rhetoric and dialectic together. When you there's the dialectical phase of liberal arts education, or the logic phase, and then there's learning dialectic. And I want to teach you how I teach dialectic in the context of a rhetoric class, and here's how I do it. But before I do that, I have to say something for the benefit of the people who were in my class yesterday. I said, you've got to understand the distinction between Hegelian dialectic and Aristotelian dialectic. And they didn't understand really what dialectic is, or Aristotelian dialectic, or Hegelian dialectic. So, here we go. Very simply. Aristotelian dialectic you will understand very well by the time we're done today. Okay? And in essence, Aristotelian dialectic is a test for the truth of propositions that are debatable. Essence of which is a search for contradiction. Dialectic is based on a search for contradictions, and the methodology of dialectic really boils down to applying the law of contradiction. Do you remember hearing that in a logic class at some point? You probably learned it as the law of non-contradiction. Interestingly, I've heard it stated both ways. So you can call it the law of contradiction or the law of non-contradiction. It makes no difference, which is ironic.
It's flammable and inflammable.
Yeah, right. So, and you'll understand why the irony is there once I define the law of contradiction for you in just like 15 minutes. Anyway, Aristotelian dialectic begins with an argument and fleshes out the presuppositions upon which the argument is based. And when you get down to the bedrock, first principle of the argument, if that you apply the law of contradiction like a spotlight to illuminate any contradiction there is in the argument. And you're supposed to reject the contradiction and embrace that part of the argument which is contradiction free. Okay, well, Hegel innovated with the concept of dialectic and came up with this notion. Hegelian dialectic is based on the thesis is a position, and eventually over time the antithesis of that position will vie for predominance in the marketplace of ideas with the thesis, and out of the two a synthesis will arise, and that synthesis itself becomes a new thesis, which then leads to a further antithesis, a new synthesis, and that's how thought progresses, according to Hegel. And so dialectical materialism, you've heard of that, right? That's one of the fundamental precepts of Marxism. Dialectical materialism is based on Hegel's concept of thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Did Hegel have a telos for his progress?
I don't know. I don't know Hegel well enough to comment on that.
Things be missing in the whole modern.
Yeah, it's just the telos is to philosophize.
The process itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the ergon and the telos have been conflated. I don't. But I'm not an expert in Hegel. I just know about Hegelian dialectic.
Well, that sounds like
enough to give.
The emergent church is like that, so it's all about dialogue, it's all about conversation, who cares about
Yeah. As long as you're engaged.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's a good thought. Jim?
I just wanted to know if you call that the Hegelian theory of dialectic. Is that what we're looking
Yes.
at here?
This is what I understand of Hegelian dialectic. And I've always intended to read my Hegel more, but I just never seem to have time to do it.
Can you comment a little more on the Marxist? Don't make it.
Dialectical materialism?
You mentioned that this is what Marx is.
Yes. The idea that society will go through phases where from the proletariat to the bourgeois, and then they'll go through a capitalist phase, and then ultimately pure communism will evolve. That's based on an inevitability that, or kind of a fatalist understanding of the evolution of society that's based on dialectical materialism, which is based on Hegelian dialectic. It's derived from Hegelian dialectic. Okay, so, but that's all, that's really, I let that go in part because it was just a passing comment that you shouldn't confuse. When people, if you ever bump into somebody who uses the term dialectic today, most of the time they'll presuppose Hegelian dialectic. And there's a vast difference between Aristotelian dialectic and Hegelian dialectic. And Aristotelian dialectic is useful for cultivating practical wisdom. Write that down. Aristotelian dialectic is useful for cultivating practical wisdom. All right? I don't use the term critical thinking, haven't used it for 10 years at least, because it's such a mixed bag. And unless you're the kind of person who can use terms loosely and feel comfortable with that, you want some precision, and critical thinking is all over the map. So I just dumped it because really I realized what I'm interested in teaching my students is practical wisdom. So I define practical wisdom as cultivating the intellectual abilities to follow an argument to its conclusion, identify and evaluate assumptions, spot faulty logic and contradictions, make appropriate distinctions. Those are all listed on your page, right? Does anybody else need some? I have 2 left. Here you go. Avoid extremes and exercise foresight. Those are what I've identified. I claim originality for this definition. You know how I did this? I was doing my, I want to disclose a little bit here because I think this will help people understand. Based on a conversation I was having with Jim back there. I was student teaching in Belfouche, South Dakota. Went to Black Hills State University, and my mentor there, Charles Follett, is a Missouri Synod Lutheran. He single-handedly sent at least 6 guys to the seminary in the last decade. Just guys that he would get them converted on his debate team. They might be agnostic or Methodist or something. And first
but I would repeat myself.
Missouri Synod Lutheranism, and then get them all excited about going to the seminary. God really blessed his teaching at Black Hills State University now. Well, he was my mentor, and he's an Aristotelian scholar who's really into Richard Weaver. He wrote his dissertation on Richard Weaver, and we would, when you debate in South Dakota, you talk for hours about things, you know, as they're on the road, and we talked about religion and politics. It was the Reagan years, you know.
Oh.
So I was trying to rebound from the 70s, and he helped me with my spiritual and emotional baggage and taught me how to think quickly on the feet. And so ever since then, I've really been trying to just pass on what I know of Richard Weaver and Aristotle and practical reasoning skills. But when I was doing my student teaching in Belfouche, there was a poster on the wall. What is critical thinking? And it kind of had bullet points like that. I don't even remember what the first ones were, but following an argument conclusion and spotting faulty logic were probably on there. But I've tweaked it over the years, and that's how I started off on what I wanted to teach my students about practical reasoning, not critical thinking skills per se, and how I view it and how I communicate to them what it is I want them to grasp. Okay, so it's evolved over, that would have been 1985. You know, so it's not rocket science, friends. Classical education is intimidating to novices, but it's grounded in how the human mind works, and it's grounded in age-appropriate learning and timeless truth. And so there's a real natural element to it that a person of insight and dedication, you know, and by the grace of God and the blessing of the Holy Spirit, should be able to pick this stuff up. Okay, so that's what I cooked up based on that poster, and I teach my students by enumerating those, and I had a little segment here. I just had a logic tutorial compiled. In fact, driving down here on I-29, I pulled over to a gas station, and I was talking with these people from California who are doing this. I was going to show you a segment of it, but it's not necessary. Let me tell you, though, what I do to contextualize practical reasoning. Rule number 1 for classical education. When you're teaching in the Trivium, you have to clue your students in to what they're supposed to be learning. That's a big oversight that happens quite often. People have an agenda. They want their kids to understand, or to them, is they want them to glean from the exercise or the the theory that you're discussing, because it seems fairly obvious to you, but it's not obvious to them. So, rule number 2, when you're teaching in the fashion of the Trivium, manageable bits of learning. Mastery of content and teaching from a great book's perspective is one thing. Learning to write well, learning to discuss seminal works, and so forth, that's one skill set. But when you're cultivating mental habits, like you are in Trivium, you have to give some theory to inform the practice. You have to talk about expectations and some nuts and bolts, then you give them an opportunity to practice what they're learning. More theory, nuts and bolts, practice. More theory, nuts and bolts, practice. It's stair step. And unit in a class where your aim is not mastery of content per se, which is to say it's not necessarily bound, but it's theory light and praxis heavy. Where your aim is that, you have to have those units set up about applying it. And like I said yesterday, I think it's really a good practice to have a non-graded exercise after you've done the theory and had a discussion of the concept that is now under discussion or that we're attempting to master. And then after they, for example, in my argumentation and debate class, which we'll discuss in fairly detailed fashion today, I teach them about casuistry, which is a method of resolving moral dilemmas that's especially experienced a renaissance in medical ethics. That my mentor in my PhD program was the chairman of the Department of Medical History and Ethics at the University of Washington. And so I teach them, first, we talk about philosophical arguments, fairly abstract, based on symbolic logic. And then we talk about arguing one's case in court of law, in a moral dilemma, and then in a policy controversy. Those are the units in my class, in argumentation debate. And so once we get to the philosophical unit, I use that more or less as a foil to distinguish analytic and speculative reasoning from rhetorical reasoning, which is more concerned with the particular case. It's streetwise. You roll up your sleeves and you get busy talking about a real world problem. Okay? And then the rest of the semester is 3 different venues: court of law, medical ethics, policy arguments. Okay? So the way I stair step the learning in that class is the first unit, I go back to Cicero and I teach them from a couple of works that are listed on the resource page there. I teach them about the concept of topoi, or topics, and then I teach them about stasis, because Hermagoras was a person who took Aristotle's concept of stasis and turned it in through a stroke of genius. He analogized it to arguing one's case in court of law. And I'll explain that right now. It's very clever. In Aristotle's physics, he identified kinesis as motion, kinetic energy, right? The kind of motion that's imparted to a billiard ball when one hits it and it goes in equal or opposite direction, right? That's kinesis. And stasis is motion that's checked. Okay? It's motion at rest. And Hermagoras thought for a while, and he said, this would be a nice analogy to use to teach the pleaders in my law school how to approach the case at hand. Because if you think about it, you have motion in the case, you're moving toward a verdict until the claims of the plaintiff check the claims of the defendant. And that's the point of stasis. And the stasis must be resolved before further progress can be made in the case. So that's the Hermagorean theory of stasis. It's brilliant. It's simple, it's theoretical, it's classical, it's illuminating. Cool beans. So, I teach them that, I have them read about it in the seminal work, and then we get busy applying it. So, in the forensic unit, they learn about how topical reasoning and stasis and all that is plays out in forensic argumentation. And then I just have them identify a First Amendment case from the Supreme Court that they find intriguing, they research it, and then they have to write a paper about it. So that's really kind of unrelated to the classical doctrine. But that's because I'm building, because guess what? We circle back around. The next unit is moral argumentation. How do you use topical logic and the concept of stasis in resolving moral dilemmas? There's this thing called casuistry. It's what I did my dissertation on. I went in and recorded medical ethics committees, and I listened to their rhetoric of the medical ethics director, the ethicist, the social worker, the nurse, the attending physician, right? And as they were attempting to make a judgment in a timely fashion on behalf of an other, where they weren't really in position to just flip a coin because that would be unprofessional. So it was meaningful dialogue, and action was the aim, not contemplation of principles. Action was the aim, not contemplation of principles. There was a lot of practical wisdom being articulated, and they were pooling their wisdom, and they were making arguments, but it wasn't a combative kind of argumentation that was occurring there. It was for the benefit of the other. So all that dynamic went into play. So I explained to my students, this is the kind of argumentation that you engage in the moral arena when you're trying to make a decision about what is the right thing to do where the right thing is debatable. And honest people can disagree about what is the right thing to do. Okay, so I'm rehearsing all of that to model for you how I clue in my students. And also how I stair step, because we circle around. Number 3, teaching within the trivium, where your aim is cultivating mental habits as opposed to mastery of content, is you don't just, have you ever sat in a class and you memorize terms in chapter 1, you regurgitate it on an exam, you push core dump, you forget that stuff, memorize terms in chapter 2, regurgitate it on an exam, so on and so forth. It's an endless stream of data, right? Very loosely related. The beauty of classical learning, as I understand it, of liberal arts learning, is that the unity of thought that you can hopefully teach your students, and the way that various concepts, principles, and theories are interrelated one with another, the integration of the learning is so much more satisfactory. But in order to do that, you have to, like I said before, you have to eliminate a lot of the reason scientific education has become so cumbersome with 1,000-page textbooks and so forth is because, as Bacon very clearly pointed out in The Advancement of Learning, because science raises further questions all the time, the universe of knowledge is expanding by diffusion. And so it just gets bigger and bigger. But you can't do that if you're trying to teach people core knowledge. and especially if your aim is cultivation of mental habits and skill sets, for example. Okay, so you have to narrow the focus, which is why, as I said yesterday, when I teach the definition for practical reasoning, I tie it into 3 tools. And I say, these tools are very basic, like a hammer, a saw, and a pair of pliers. I try to get the students thinking in very simplistic terms early on, because I don't want to overwhelm them for one thing, and I want them to think in practical terms, and the metaphors you use are very important. So any attempt I can make, to clarify what they're supposed to be learning and keep it manageable, I think helps. And those are the kinds of things teachers tend to overlook, because it's so obvious to them what they're up to and what the kids are supposed to be learning. But this is the hard part of teaching, as far as I'm concerned, because it's much easier to teach content. Mastery of content is easy to teach, it's easy to master, and it's easy to test. But cultivation of skills is non-obvious. So it takes a lot of research. And I'm doing that right now too. I keep repeating why I'm teaching the way I'm teaching. Hopefully that'll click for you. So the 3 tools are syllogistic logic, dialectic, and common material fallacies. As I've studied the liberal arts curriculum, when it comes to mastering dialectic and rhetoric, the 3 most basic tools that people need to learn in a core course. And they should be learning it at 14, 15 years of age. That's when they're intellectually equipped, if they're well educated. This is the kicker, and this is why I still have a job at the college level. Because hardly any students are educated in that fashion. Even at Patrick Henry College, probably a third of the kids had a decent classical education in their home schooling experience. The rest of them, it's very spotty what they got. Okay, so the 3 tools are syllogistic logic, dialectic, and common material fallacies. Okay, now, syllogistic logic is tied to learning to follow an argument to its conclusion. Do you see that in the definition there? Following an argument to its conclusion is specifically addressed through learning syllogisms. And then to identify assumptions is also the outcome of learning syllogistic logic. But evaluating assumptions is not the business of training in syllogism. Do you understand that? It's got to do with the difference between validity and truth. So I make this distinction and I say, look, I'm not going to teach you anything you don't already do in my class. You already do it, but you do it intuitively. I want to teach you an art of eloquence and an art of wisdom. And that entails theory and practice and so forth. I detailed that yesterday. You can get a lot of this off the rhetoric ring, by the way, which is, in your handout, there's an address for rhetoric. Anyway, so I make a distinction between identifying and evaluating assumptions, and then I teach that first we're going to learn how to identify assumptions, to follow an argument to its conclusion, and learn something about valid arguments. And then you're going to give a speech where you have to analyze both sides of the argument and in an even-handed way, and you have to identify some of the underlying assumptions down below the surface on both sides. Okay? And then in the persuasive speech, where you're refuting the side you disagree with, you have to identify the fallacies you find in their argument, where's their logic breakdown, and if they contradict themselves, then you should do the dialectic. Okay? So, that's all preliminary. Here we are today. We're going to learn to do the dialectic.
Lord. Certainly, we clap.
Do we have a clap on it?
Clap on, clap on. Okay. There we go. I apologize for the gaps. There were no gaps for the people that were in my session yesterday, I'm pretty sure. I filled all of those. I backfilled. But I can't review all that today, I'm sorry. But I will certainly dialogue with you if you wish. If I can be of any help, you can email me and we'll talk. So, dialectic, within that context, wait a minute, put that on hold. I'm not ready for that context yet. Continuing on, I said I stair step, I teach them topical logic and stasas, and then I transition from forensic argumentation to moral argumentation. I teach them casuistry, and casuistry deepens their understanding of topical reasoning and stasas, and then I add new concepts, maxims, and something else, I can't remember. But, a topology is a collection of special topics. How many of you have been around debate? Okay? All right. In debate, in policy debate, there's a thing called the stock issues model. I'm going to say this very quickly. Don't take notes on it, please. You'll just get confused. When an advocate of changing the status quo wants to persuade that their policy should be adopted, it's incumbent on them to prove that there is a problem, that it's a significant problem, and that it warrants change, what the causes of the problem are, a solution, they propose a solution for the problem, and they have to persuade that it's cost effective or desirable. That's called the stock issues model for policy debate. And it's designed for two purposes, for constructive purposes and destructive purposes, as Aristotle put it, which means this. It's a guide to constructing a case in a policy argument. It's also a guide to understand how those issues work and the interplay of the issues. It's a guide to deconstructing the case that you're hearing. It works both ways. That's another way to understand the stock issues model is a collection of special topics, which is called a topology. Okay? Hermagoras had a topology. It's called the stasa system. Ansit, quidsit, qualicit. What happened? Think of court of law. Court of law. What happened? Was what happened illegal? Quidsit. And then the question that follows would be, how illegal was it? That's qualicit. What was the quality of the act? Okay, so, not the central point here. The central point is this. In the forensic unit, I teach them about Hermagoras' stasa system, and I tell them, in terms of topical reasoning, this is a collection of special topics we call a topology, and I let it rest, and I let it simmer, and I let them ruminate. And then in the unit on moral argumentation, when I teach them casuistry, I say, my mentor was Albert Johnson. He wrote this little clinical ethics book that's supposed to fit in your smock when you're out on the floor providing medical services. And you pull it out if you have a question, and it's arranged topically around Johnson's topology. Johnson's topology is a way of organizing one's understanding of the case at hand. It's a collection of special topics which are the following. Medical indications. If you are going to present a case in a medical dilemma, you present the facts of the case. Here's what the situation is. Here's the diagnosis. Here's the treatment. Here's the prognosis. Right? That's the logical place to start. It's the equivalent of, and sit, what happened in the case. Statement of the facts of the case. The next question, or the next issue in Johnson's topology is medical indications. Or, I'm sorry, medical indications is first. The next one is patient preferences, which is based on the ethical principle of autonomy. The next one after that is quality of life, and the final one is context. That is a collection of special topics, and it guides inquiry into the crux of the matter, but it also helps you construct your case. Topical reasoning, forensics, moral argumentation and medical ethics, debate. The stock issues model is a topology. Harms, significance, plan, and desirability. Those are the stock issues of policy. So they learn in a variety of contexts the same concept, but they don't learn the same thing about the concept at each unit. They learn a little bit more. It's scarce. Okay? I wanted to make sure that came through clearly. Circling around the same information is an important facet of teaching in the Trivium, where the aim is mastery of skill sets and cultivation of intellectual habits as opposed to mastery of content. Alright, what did I put on hold? I was just ready to get into dialectic. Alright. Questions before we move on? Throwing a lot at you. I give a very dense presentation, that's why I have the handouts, so hopefully you can follow along. Questions, clarification? Is it making sense? Alright. I'm trying to give you the context within which I present dialectic to them. So, what I was just explaining was my argumentation and debate course. In my rhetoric course is where I first introduced them to dialectic, but then in the argumentation and debate class, we review it. In the boot camp of the mind, which is the first 4 weeks of argumentation and debate, I think this is actually good process knowledge as well. I teach them syllogistic logic, dialectic, and common material fallacies in their rhetoric class. In their argumentation and debate class, I teach them syllogistic logic before the analysis of controversy speech, which is their first major assignment. There are other preliminary assignments just to get the jitters out and break the ice, okay? Then, when the real substance of the course hits, I whip out training in syllogistic logic. And remember I said you have to keep it manageable? I don't teach them about disjunctive syllogisms, hypothetical syllogisms, and categorical syllogisms. Guess which one I teach? Categorical. Guess why? Because it's easy to understand. They can grasp it. And it's not a logic class, it's a rhetoric class. But logic and rhetoric are counterparts of one another. So, I just teach them the categorical syllogism because I want them to figure out how to identify assumptions. Because in their upcoming assignment, they cannot just say, here's what these people say, and here's what these people say. Here's what they say, here's what they say. Here's what they say, here's what they say. I want them to also explain to me what they're not saying, because what's not being said oftentimes is where the crux of the matter lies. That's where the real clash comes. What's being taken for granted, assumed, or masked. Am I right? Intuitively, you know that's true. So, I just teach them the categorical syllogism because that does the trick. And then, when it's time for the persuasive speech, Dialectic and common material fallacies are tests for truth, validity, truth. Unpacking an argument versus refuting an argument. Identifying an assumption versus evaluating an assumption. Got it? Okay, good. So dialectic is the most basic test for truth. Because the most basic logical error is what? Self-contradiction. Okay, so dialectic is a test for the truth of propositions of a contingent nature, which means they're debatable. So in the contingent realm, the realm of mathematical reasoning and analytic reasoning is called the positive realm. That's the realm of absolute certainty. But where questions are open to debate, you need to have an instrument that will help you approach those questions with practical wisdom, because to just flip a coin would be irresponsible. But if you ask certain logicians who are very staunch logicians, they would say, well, any matter of opinion is just a crapshoot anyway, because everybody's opinion is equally valid, and they're all fallacious. So if you can't prove with mathematical certainty what is the right thing to do, then you're ethically obligated to inaction. That doesn't work if you're on the floor in the hospital and someone presents with a difficult case. You've got to act. So what do you do then? Okay? Dialectic helps equip one for practical wisdom in that sense. It can be understood as a three-step process. That's right here. Right here in the notes. You begin with an assumption or a proposition, an assertion. There are lots of synonyms one could use there. And then you push it to its logical conclusion, drawing out implications. And then ultimately, apply the law of contradiction. Okay, we need to unpack this a little bit. Dialectic is exemplified in the Socratic Method. Now we're talking. Everybody here understands the Socratic Method, right? You've read Platonic dialogue. How does Socrates interact with his interlocutor? They begin with a proposition. Tell me, what did your master Thrasymachus have to say today that was interesting? Oh, Socrates, it was amazing. Let's walk along the bank of the Ilyssus and talk about the highest good for the human. I can think of no other more important subject. And so he draws out from the interlocutor what Thrasymachus had to say about the highest good for the human being. And then he commences to ask questions, right? And are those, in the Socratic Method, are those questions just kind of arbitrary questions? Not at all. Why are they not arbitrary? What gives them focus and coherence? Where are they heading with it? Besides down the banks of the Ilyssus.
They're heading toward a solution together.
They're heading toward the premise upon which the proposition rests. The ground of the argument. The questioning takes you deeper and deeper by following what? Inferences. You follow the inferences that take you through the logical progression down the chain of argument to the bedrock upon which the argument rests, and then you whip out this spotlight of the law of contradiction and you try to illuminate where there's a contradiction in the argument once you get to the bedrock. Okay? And that, in a Platonic dialogue, that takes like 10 pages most of the time, right? That's what makes it difficult for American students to read Platonic dialogues. You have to have a lot of imagination and a lot of patience. Okay, so dialectic is exemplified in the Socratic Method, and it can be understood as a three-step process in which you begin with a proposition, you push it to its logical conclusion, drawing out implications, which takes you to the principle upon which the argument rests, and then you apply the law of contradiction, which is stated in the Metaphysics 1011b 13. The most undisputable of all beliefs is that contradictory statements are not at the same time true. You can't say something contradictory at the same time about one thing. I cannot say this is an Apple and a PC. Well, I guess it is generally, a personal computer, but PC is associated with IBM-based machines. Okay. I couldn't say this is purified water and sewage. No, it's not. I wouldn't be drinking. Okay? It's not rocket science. The law of contradiction comes from Aristotle, and it sounds high and lofty, but it's very basic, and it's based on Aristotle's observation of how the mind works. Most of the liberal arts education is based on human nature, how we think, how we reason, and trying to get people to cultivate those abilities by consciously reflecting on intuitive processes or processes, as Dr. Court tells us. Okay, so the law of contradiction, the most undisputable of all beliefs, is that contradictory statements are not at the same time true. That's all he means by that. It makes nonsense to say this is A and not A of the same thing. Okay, and it's just like the law of definition, and there are laws of thought that have to do with meaning making and coherence that Aristotle observed and wrote about in his Metaphysics especially, but also in other of his treatises. Okay, so let's just read. One of them is topics. Aristotle's Topica is explicitly concerned with dialectic. It's where he taught his students how to engage in disputations. So, dialectic is also a mode of disputation. It's a form of debate. And in fact, they had dialectical competitions to the death in the Olympiads. Yes, they did. When the idea is elenchus is when you get your opponent to commit a contradiction. Okay? And so, in the most extreme cases, you literally were living by your wits. And if you've got your opponent to commit elenchus, they lose big time. But that was rare. But disputations is also synonymous with dialectic. And Aristotle had a big problem with his students losing to the students of the Sophists. So he wrote a little compendium of fallacies for his students so they could learn how to deal with the tricks of the Sophists. And it's an appendix to the Topica called On Sophistical Refutations. It's in the Great Books of the Western World. Same volume. Okay? So, now Bill made me wonder what time I'm supposed to be done. 11:15? Alright. So, in the Topica, Aristotle teaches his students about dialectic, and appended to the Topica is the first compendium in the Western world of fallacies. Okay, so the label dialectician is ascribed almost exclusively to competitors in mental gymnastics. So a dialectician was somebody who engaged in dialectical competition. Aristotle's final exhortation to the would-be disputant indicates a higher concern than mere competition. Moreover, as contributing to knowledge and to philosophic wisdom, the power of discerning and holding in one view the results of either of two hypotheses is no mean instrument, for it only remains to make a right choice of one of them. That's in the Topics 163b9. 163b9 would be the Berlin numbers. that's a means of cataloging all the works of Aristotle. It's equivalent to chapter and verse. Okay, but you see there, dialectic is not just about academic exercises and mental gymnastics. It's also useful. Learning dialectical reasoning skills is helpful in practical living and thinking well and quick wit. So I don't like to teach dialectic in a simplistic way. I like people to understand it in a multifaceted way, because as I read Aristotle, I find all kinds of nuances here about the value of dialectic. And I'm hoping this is news to you, because I don't think this awareness of dialectic is all that common anymore, but it's very fruitful. Aristotle maintains the distinction between dialectical disputation and dialectical inquiry throughout his topics. Dialectic should be understood also as, quote, a process of criticism wherein lies the path to the principles of all inquiries. This is the final facet of dialectic I want you to grasp. Learning to reason this way helps a student think deeply in the realm of principles and to understand the unity of ideas, how this idea relates to that one. If there's anything I can think of that I value most about learning the reasoning processes that I've learned in debate and through the years studying rhetoric and dialectic and reading Richard Weaver, it's that it helps you get beyond the noise that is the crush of postmodernity, to see with clarity. And you've noticed this as you've classically educated your kids, have you not? That the value of this is it helps you discriminate between what's tangential and what's essential. And it helps you get down to a place where you can actually appreciate unity of knowledge. And it's so hard to do that when you're just bombarded with data from 1,000-page textbooks. Right? Classical learning gives you clarity of vision. It gives you mental dexterity, and it gives you coherent thought process. Learning dialectic in this way really aids in that process. Let's read a little Richard Weaver. It's actually not a little Richard Weaver, it's right. This will be a jump here, so let me make room for questions and comments. Are you tracking with this? I hope you enjoy it. Honestly, it saddens me when people tell me that most of what I said went over their head, because I'm reaching out with everything I've got. I want people to understand. I really do. I really honestly believe if I can understand it, you can understand it. But it's hard to digest it all in an hour session, of course. But is there anything where I was so far over your head and you're kind of grasping and you want to take it home with you? I want to make sure you do. Yes. What's your name again?
I'm Kelly.
Kelly.
The Socratic style that you mentioned.
The Socratic Method. Very big in education.
Yeah, in my curriculum, based on the Trivium, that refers to rhetoric. Would that be appropriate to weave those dialogues into the dialect of my students?
The Socratic Method, I said it's very...
We have a little, like a playbook of questioning. I haven't done much with that. Would that be appropriate to weave in if my student proceeds to the dialectic?
That's even big in secular education departments. The Socratic Method is a big deal these days. It's supposed to be your habit of drawing what students know out of them by questioning rather than dispensing data as an authority at all times.
I think it's in my curriculum that way to model it for me as a teacher.
Yes.
And I haven't done much with it yet, but I should maybe, I'm getting the sense of start weaving that in.
It doesn't belong, compartmentalizing, I don't have a lot of patience for compartmentalizing everything.
Progressive education.
Yeah, that's supposed to be done in this class. Nah, it all kind of does meld together where it's appropriate. The Socratic Method could be used to unpack the meaning of a story, a moral tale, you know.
Well, sir, maybe I'm
and
doing that already.
you probably are, because it's based on intuitive skills, and how you would, a good teacher would normally do that. Somebody figured out a way to package that strategy and call it the Socratic Method. And it can be overdone just like anything, because you do need to speak from a position of authority where it's appropriate. I do all the time, and I actually sometimes get in trouble because I come across like an authoritarian. And some of my homeschool kids have no respect for authority, because they were raised by countercultural types who are subversive. They ingrain in their kids disrespect of authority. Well, you just got your PhD in the secular world, who cares? That's pagan knowledge. That's not Christian knowledge. That kind of stuff. Anyway, that's my personal knowledge. Anyway, yeah, I didn't expect that. But
This is the
yes. Yes. There are a lot of countercultural types that homeschool their kids and did very well with them, but they also ingrained in them that kind of people. So anyway, you're supposed to speak with authority, but if that's all you ever do and you think of yourself as a sage on the stage, that's not good classical education, if you ask me, or liberal arts education.
I'm asking, my son was pushing that ideal age, you say, you know, and this is not how I was taught. So I'm a little uncomfortable with it, but as I'm looking ahead to the rhetoric level,
Yes.
and you're speaking, I'm thinking maybe I need to read that a little bit more as we're continuing in our
Read
journey.
Little John and Evans' Wisdom and Eloquence. They have a little curriculum in there that starts in the earlier grades. And you can do rhetoric with kids that are really small. You just don't teach them rhetoric. You help them cultivate an ear for the musicality and language, right? You teach them rhythms and meter and that sort of thing. And then when they're older, you can teach them what they were appreciating. Help them learn to consciously reflect on it. And then in the rhetoric phase, they learn how to create beauty and truth.
I'm beginning to see that. You know,
Good.
but.
Good. Glad to hear it. Anyone else? Yes, Jim?
I understand everything that you're saying, I just don't remember what you're saying, and I follow right along. My problem
That's hypnotism.
is, my point is, I have never had lunch. Question you can answer after, though, will be this: what would be the small catechism of Trivium of Logic, so the 9 little pieces of help for the rest of this?
Aristotle's Organon. You are classically oriented, yes? You appreciate classical works. Having listened to me and been mesmerized by me, you can pick up Aristotle's categories. Okay, if you look in the great books of the Western world, the organon are gathered together. Organon means instrument. His collected works on logic are called the organon because it's his means of teaching how to reason. Okay, so you have the categories, and that's like, this is a verb, this is a noun. You put them together, you have a sentence. A declarative sentence is a proposition. A proposition in doubt is a question. Boom, boom, boom. Totally systematic. Okay? Then, prior analytics and posterior analytics. Guess what those are about? Right? And then the topic is a segue from analytic reasoning and demonstrative, which is, demonstrative is, allow me to demonstrate, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Okay, that's demonstrative reasoning, and analytic reasoning is based on logical necessity. Then the topics is about dialectical reasoning, which is at home not in the positive realm, but in the contingent realm. It's a shifting of focus away from what is absolutely and necessarily true to what is probably true. What? What's that? Why would Christians want to deal with probable truth? Okay. What does beyond a reasonable doubt mean? Question. In the courts of law in America, do we convict people in capital crimes unto death without eyewitness testimony? All the time. How could that be just? Because if you stack up enough probabilities with a high degree of certitude, moral certitude, and expert testimony, and circumstantial evidence, it can become so overwhelming, no reasonable person would have doubt. Yes, this person committed that crime. Even unto death? Even unto death. So, it's not a crapshoot, it's not a coin toss, it matters, but it's not mathematical. There are people who would say, well, our legal system should be based on pure deductive reasoning and absolute proof. But it's not that tidy. Life isn't that tidy. And justice, the pursuit of justice is not that tidy. So there's a limitation to how much you can deduce from principles. What is the right thing to do where the right thing is to do? Got it? Okay. That does not mean it's all relative. This is not radical relativism. It's a measured relativism. It's appropriate given the gray areas of life. Lutherans understand this, don't we? Sir.
Well, as you're talking, it reminded me of sort of how we have to argue the support for the liturgy. Because Scripture does not have any specific points where it says, here's the liturgy you're supposed to use.
It's not in the Bible.
People are fundamentalists in their way of looking at things to say, hey, it's not in the Bible, we can do whatever we want.
Yeah.
And you have to make an argument that says, no, there's principles set up, there is a preponderance of evidence that...
And there's the weight of historical practice.
Right.
How much do you weigh it?
Right.
Ever thought about that? How much should this weigh? How much does it weigh? Is that an appropriate weight or not?
So we've gotten very fundamentalist in our doctrinal way
Yeah.
of thinking. Just if the Bible says it, it's okay. If it doesn't say it, you don't
Well
have to worry
said.
about it.
Yes, sir.
I was just going to comment that, in fact, that all matters of fact, when you're talking about an event in the end of probabilistic. You ask any police officer who has to interview three witnesses to a car accident.
12 Angry Men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, every
I saw it
classroom
through that L train. Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah.
You ask 3 different kids what happened, you get 3 different stories.
Yes. So even eyewitness testimony is open to doubt of a right. So yeah, in that sense, I don't even remember who argued this. It's probably Aristotle. It says that probable arguments in court of law are more reliable than eyewitness testimony because your eyes can deceive you. But if the pleader persuades people that this is likely the case, and the likelihood is very high, that this is very, very likely. Of course, we don't know for certain, but it's very, very likely the case. If they're persuaded, they're persuaded. That's reliable. That's kind of interesting. That puts a different spin on the whole dichotomy between fact and opinion. But enlightenment, people who are prone to an enlightenment viewpoint, rationalists, hold this hard and fast fact-value split, and they say, well, the opinion's just open to perversion and not reliable, and we just need to operate on fact. But much of life does not admit that kind of So then that begs the question, what are the tools that one can use to negotiate those tensions and that gray area and make proper discriminations, avoid extremes, follow an argument to its conclusion where the argument is complex and convoluted, and so on and so forth. That's where training in rhetoric and dialectic together equips one. And it shouldn't wait till college, in my opinion. It can happen as soon as the kid starts to have the ability to abstract a little bit. You know, maybe 9th grade or so. 9th, 10th grade. Weaver. Now, rhetoric, as we have discussed it in relation to the lovers, consists of truth plus its artful presentation, and for this reason it becomes necessary to say something more about the natural order of dialectic and rhetoric. The lover is the person, in the Phaedrus, the thesis is about the lover, the base lover, and the non-lover. The lover loves the beloved and has the beloved's best interest in mind, and tries to bring the beloved more into a relationship that reflects his God. And the non-lover is calculating and aloof. And the base lover consumes the beloved. Self-interest. Okay? So, Weaver equates there the pure dialectician with the non-lover, and the person who combines dialectic and rhetoric with the true lover. Okay. In any general characterization, rhetoric will include dialectic, but for the study of method, it is necessary to separate the two. Dialectic is a method of investigation whose object is the establishment of truth about doubtful propositions. With its forecast of the actual possibility, rhetoric passes from mere scientific demonstration of an idea to its relation to prudential conduct. A dialectic must take place in vacuo, and the fact alone that it contains contraries leaves it an intellectual thing. Rhetoric, on the other hand, always espouses one of the contraries. This espousal is followed by some attempt at impingement upon actuality. That is why rhetoric, with its passion for the actual, is more complete than mere dialectic with its dry understanding. It is more complete on the premise that man is a creature of passion who must live out that passion in the world. Pure contemplation does not suffice for this end. As Jacques Maritain has expressed it, love is not directed at possibilities or pure essences, it is directed at what exists. One does not love possibilities, one loves that which exists or is destined to exist. The complete man, then, is the lover added to the scientist, the rhetorician to the dialectician. Understanding followed by actualization seems to be the order of creation, and there is no need for the role of rhetoric to be misconceived. The pure dialectician is left in the theoretical position of the non-lover, who can attain understanding, but who cannot add impulse to truth. He has no capacity to move the soul toward truth. I am now looking for questions. Did you like that, James? I cannot get over Weaver. He's just fascinating. How?
One of the lingering questions I have in the background is that, you know, you're talking about the process of dialect being almost a game, you know, battling it out and looking for contradictions.
Yes.
That's kind of what it became in the Scholastic era, and that's the critique that
An
they
academic
had a
thing.
new organ on, and that Luther had too.
Yes.
I mean, it had a lot of debate and a lot of fun, but it didn't really lead those things and things that didn't really do anything.
It was all academic. It was academicized, and therefore rhetoric was marginalized. That's what part of the rhetorical revolution
Okay. So that's what you
is
kind
to
of
make
responded
it
to.
more
Give
practically useful. Rhetoric is supposed to be an art, and in its relation to dialectic, it's
very critical in the cultivation of a well-rounded person. Yes, sir.
1 minute,
Yeah, I was just answering the question.
45 seconds.
Quick question.
So Weaver is basically kind of a way of preserving Aristotle in lieu of Bacon's and Luther's dislike of it.
I'll tell you why Luther didn't like Aristotle. Because Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics presupposes could be used to really reinforce works righteousness. But he says his works on logic and rhetoric are valuable. Let's not make a mistake there and throw the out the basketball. And I like his Nicomachean Ethics too, contrary to Luther, but I understand the point Luther was trying to make. And I don't draw my theology from Aristotle. So I think a lot of the Nicomachean Ethics in terms of intellectual virtues and things like that, I don't confuse moral virtue with intellectual virtue. I think the intellectual virtues Aristotle delineates in the Nicomachean are very helpful to know about. But what Luther was trying to do is combat Augustinianism and Thomism insofar as they were using Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics to teach the theology of works. So of course he's going to excoriate